So meningococcus is the what people see as kind of the scariest cause of bacterial meningitis. A very common cause of bacterial meningitis is Streptococcus pneumoniae, which is really ubiquitous and causes lots of different infections. This bacterium causes, well, it can infect something like 10 different parts of the body in a specific way. So it's more common, and it has its own name. They call it pneumococcus. And so you may have heard of the pneumococcal vaccine that we try to get older people to take to protect them mostly from pneumonia, but it also is a common cause of bacterial meningitis. So this one causes more pneumonia than meningitis, but it's so much more common that it is the most common cause of meningitis. It's not the most severe, but it is the most common. So having one pneumococcal infection seems to be a risk factor for having another. So if someone is dealing with pneumonia and they have some kind of damage to their blood-brain barrier, there is a likelihood they'll get meningitis also. So that is a complicated thing, and there is overlap between these diseases caused by pneumococcus. But as we might expect, it typically is targeting people with weaker immune systems, so older adults, infants, people with suppressed immune systems. And these are the people in whom it's having the most severe forms. So it also might be infecting healthy people without much in the way of symptoms. So it does seem to be the case that a fully functioning immune system can fight this off. And we could say the same thing about Haemophilus influenzae. Haemophilus is often a member of the resident microbiota of the pharynx, and it's well known for doing things like causing ear infections in children, but it can do a lot of other things. And it's named this because they thought it caused influenza before viruses were understood. So during the 1918 influenza pandemic, lots of people died with this bacterium in their pharynx and in their lungs. And the idea there is that this bacterium was already in them, colonizing them as part of the resident microbiota. And once influenza wrecked their immune system, then the immune system stopped controlling Haemophilus influenzae, and maybe Haemophilus is what killed them. In some cases, that's probably what happened, but that never would have happened if they hadn't gotten a bad strain of influenza first. And this is something we see now. Influenza itself doesn't kill people. Usually what happens is the secondary bacterial infection will come in and be much more severe than it ever would have under any other circumstance. So that's kind of what it's famous for. And specifically the type B, or the Hib, can cause a very nasty meningitis. We don't see as much of this as we did because we can vaccinate people against the Hib, and we can vaccinate children, and that's a very good development in medicine. So this spells out some of these facts, and again, I just point out that cephalosporins again come up as the main treatment. And then the last thing is there are other causes of meningitis from bacteria, lots of other weird ones like Listeria, which is a psychotroph and can grow in a refrigerator, though it's normally associated with different things. And we've already seen these eukaryotes. And so if you go back and look at the eukaryotes notes, what it would say is, in severe cases, these can infect the central nervous system, especially when people with weakened immune systems can't control the infection. And then Naegleria fowleri causes a distinct infection. It actually attacks the brain tissue itself, and it's almost invariably fatal. Okay, so now we shift gears in a big way and go from bacteria directly infecting the meninges to bacteria that would grow in some part of the body and release a toxin, and that toxin directly attacks neurons. So tetanus is a disease that comes from the bacterium Clostridium tetani. As a member of the Clostridia, it is an obligate anaerobe that can form endospores. And so we see this, there are several pathogens from this genus. And since it's an obligate anaerobe, we only really see this disease when the bacteria can get into us in a weird way. So this is what people are afraid of when someone steps on a nail and it punctures deeply into the foot. Because a narrow wound that kind of closes behind itself can create an anaerobic environment in the deep tissues. If the oxygen is mostly bound up in hemoglobin, which can happen, if the wound itself causes some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, inflammation that leads to some kind of ischemia and weaker blood flow, that can lead to an anaerobic environment. And in those situations, the endospores, which are normally what would get into a person, the endospores germinate and turn into vegetative clostridial cells, so cells that are capable of growing and dividing and doing the things they do. When that happens, they release this toxin. When they release this toxin, the toxin can circulate through the body and directly interact with neurons, and that's what it does. And this famous painting of a person in the midst of a severe tetanus episode, what they're showing is every skeletal muscle in the body is contracting as strongly as it can and cannot relax. It cannot uncontract. That's what tetanus does in the most severe cases. Ultimately, it's very dangerous because it can paralyze the diaphragm and prevent breathing. And so we have treatments for this. We have a vaccine against it, an antitoxin, lots of different ways of treating this, but it's an emergency when someone gets tetanus. It can come on gradually, like someone will see first paralysis in the face that will then spread, and I'm not sure how that works, but the most distinctive sign of tetanus is the grotesque grin that happens when facial muscles get paralyzed. So, and what it's named after, lockjaw, what happens here is that the elevators of the mandible, so the temporalis and the masseter, they get stuck in the fully contracted position, so a person can't open their mouth, among other things. So the toxin is incredibly potent, and what it does in nanogram quantities, so vanishingly small amounts of it, they interfere with the inhibitory signals going down the spinal cord. And so that's how it leads to this intense contraction that won't let up. The varied fatality rate has to do with both where the infection happens and how much medical attention a person can get. And we'll see on the next slide what medical attention would look like. But this is somewhat common. Any physician would know about this, because we have to be prepared to treat it since it is very dangerous. So let's think back to the Clostridia and what they do. This bacterium is quite happy growing in a corpse, and so if it gets into a person and kills them using its potent neurotoxin, it then has a head start eating the corpse in front of all the other bacteria that might want it. So once that has happened and there's nothing left to eat, all the clostridial cells will sporulate and just transform into endospores, and they will wait for decades or centuries for the next opportunity to kill a mammal. So that's something. Right, so we do have a vaccine, and if you've taken like Tdap or DTaP or the DT or DPT vaccines, those all have, the T stands for tetanus. And the idea is that with those, antibodies can rapidly bind to the toxin and prevent it from interacting with our receptors. The immune globulins are the most effective thing. We would just inject those directly, and then the person would have an accelerated antibody response because it would start with antibodies they didn't even have to make. But then if they've been immunized, they get the secondary immune activation within a day that would protect them. But then stopping the infection prevents more toxin from being made. So surgical debridement removes a lot of the bacteria and helps blood flow to the tissues. And then whatever is necessary to keep the person alive until the toxin breaks down. And the amazing thing about this is that if we can keep a person alive, eventually they will make a full recovery. And the same thing is true of botulism, which is caused by Clostridium botulinum. And this has the same kind of lifestyle in that it forms endospores and can wait forever or whatever, but it can only grow in an anaerobic environment or anoxic environment in the absence of oxygen. So that always is going to affect our relationship to these bacteria, because anytime you can make sure an environment is properly oxygenated, you are protected against the Clostridia. This is a foodborne pathogen. If we just ingest the botulism toxin, that can be fatal. So if endospores contaminate food, or if the bacteria were growing in something which we then consumed, we can get botulism. One way or another, the toxin gets into us through the digestive tract, usually. And this is most common. Another thing to know is that babies can get it from honey in some cases. And the thing with the baby is that a tiny number of the endospores, which would be harmless to an adult, and I'll explain that in a second, is not harmless to a baby. So in an adult, if we eat a small number of endospores, they're going to be killed by our stomach or killed in the gut by other much more effective anaerobic bacteria in the large intestine. Those endospores can't compete for nutrients. The Clostridium just isn't necessarily adapted to our guts, that species. But an infant's gut bacteria are not as well established and not as competitive, and they don't have the advanced structure that really limits resources. So the bacteria can live in the large intestine of a young baby and get botulism from that. Oddly, infant botulism isn't as hazardous as adult botulism, but it's all dangerous. So let's see. Yeah, what people would see is lots of different signs associated with paralysis. So their vision goes double because they can't independently move their eyes very well, and eventually they lose control of their skeletal muscles. And these were it causes flaccid paralysis. I can't remember whether I said that or not, but what it's going to do, unlike tetanus, what botulism does is cause the muscles to relax and be unable to contract. The biggest risk of botulism seems to be home canning of vegetables. So if you do home canning, you probably know that foods that don't have acidity So canning beans, for example, you're supposed to use the really good pressurized canning systems, because you basically have to inactivate endospores on the vegetables. If you don't do that, it's likely that some Clostridial endospores are there and they will germinate in the can. What is so special about canned foods that makes botulism grow in them? Well, let me tell you. It turns out if you boil water, you, by definition, physically remove all dissolved gases from the water. So if you have boiling water, there's no oxygen dissolved in it. There's no nitrogen dissolved in it. And that means that in any canning process where you're boiling the water to sterilize, people would think, the vegetables, you're driving off all the oxygen. And if you then seal them in a can, well, endospores that have made it through that process get a anaerobic environment with plenty of food as soon as the cans cool off. So they can germinate in the can, and that can put people at risk of botulism when they eat that food. And it's possible then that you will get botulism from the food that you canned. So that's a lot of the guidelines about how to can foods are aimed at preventing growth of Clostridia in the food. And how do we treat it? Well, it's like tetanus, in that keeping someone alive is the most important thing, and eventually a person would typically recover if they survive. Let's see. Right. Okay. And that's it for and that's enough for one video. We'll be back shortly to talk about leprosy.